Book 3, Chapter 3 of One of Ours. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. One of Ours by Willa Cather. Chapter 3. After the heavy work of harvest was over, Mrs. Wheeler often persuaded her husband, when he was starting off in his buckboard, to take her as far as Claude's new house. She was glad Enid didn't keep her parlor dark, as Mrs. Royce kept hers. The doors and windows were always open, the vines and the long petunias in the window boxes waved in the breeze, and the rooms were full of sunlight and in perfect order. Enid wore white dresses about her work, and white shoes and stockings. She managed the house easily and systematically. On Monday morning Claude turned the washing machine before he went to work, and by 9 o'clock the clothes were on the line. Enid liked to iron, and Claude had never before in his life worn so many clean shirts, or worn them with such satisfaction. She told him he need not economize in working shirts. It was as easy to iron 6 as 3. Although within a few months Enid's car traveled more than 2,000 miles for the Prohibition cause, it could not be said that she neglected her house for reform. Whether she neglected her husband depended on one's conception of what was his due. When Mrs. Wheeler saw how well their little establishment was conducted, how cheerful and attractive Enid looked when one happened to drop in there, she wondered that Claude was not happy. And Claude himself wondered. If his marriage disappointed him in some respects, he ought to be a man, he told himself, and make the best of what was good in it. If his wife didn't love him, it was because love meant one thing to him and quite another thing to her. She was proud of him, was glad to see him when he came in from the fields, and was solicitous for his comfort. Everything about a man's embrace was distasteful to Enid, something inflicted upon women, like the pain of childbirth, for Eve's transgression, perhaps. This repugnance was more than physical. She disliked ardor of any kind, even religious ardor. She had been fonder of Claude before she married him than she was now, but she hoped for a readjustment. Perhaps sometime she could like him again in exactly the same way. Even Brother Weldon had hinted to her that for the sake of their future tranquillity she must be lenient with the boy. And she thought she had been lenient. She could not understand his moods of desperate silence, the bitter, biting remarks he sometimes dropped, his evident annoyance if she went over to join him in the timber claim, when he lay there idle in the deep grass on a Sunday afternoon. Claude used to lie there and watch the clouds, saying to himself, "It's the end of everything for me." Other men than he must have been disappointed, and he wondered how they bore it through a lifetime. Claude had been a well-behaved boy because he was an idealist. He had looked forward to being wonderfully happy in love, and to deserving his happiness. He had never dreamed that it might be otherwise. Sometimes now, when he went out into the fields on a bright summer morning, it seemed to him that nature not only smiled, but broadly laughed at him. He suffered in his pride, but even more in his ideals, in his vague sense of what was beautiful. Enid could make his life hideous to him without ever knowing it. At such times he hated himself for accepting at all her grudging hospitality. He was wronging something in himself. In her person Enid was still attractive to him. He wondered why she had no shades of feeling to correspond to her natural grace and lightness of movement, to the gentle, almost wistful attitudes of body in which he sometimes surprised her. When he came in from work and found her sitting on the porch, leaning against a pillar, her hands clasped about her knees, her head drooping a little, he could scarcely believe in the rigidity which met him at every turn. Was there something repellent in him? Was it, after all, his fault? Enid was rather more indulgent with his father than with anyone else, he noticed. Mr. Wheeler stopped to see her almost every day, and even took her driving in his old buckboard. Bayliss came out from town to spend the evening occasionally. Enid's vegetarian suppers suited him, and as she worked with him in the Prohibition campaign, they always had business to discuss. Bayliss had a social as well as a hygienic prejudice against alcohol, and he hated it less for the harm it did than for the pleasure it gave. Claude consistently refused to take any part in the activities of the Anti-Saloon League, or to distribute what Bayliss and Enid called our literature. In the farming towns the term literature was applied only to a special kind of printed matter. There was Prohibition literature, sex hygiene literature, and, during a scourge of cattle disease, there was hoof and mouth literature. This special application of the word didn't bother Claude, but his mother, being an old-fashioned schoolteacher, complained about it. Enid did not understand her husband's indifference to a burning question, and could only attribute it to the influence of Ernest Havel. She sometimes asked Claude to go with her to one of her committee meetings. If it was a Sunday, he said he was tired and wanted to read the paper. If it was a weekday, he had something to do at the barn, or meant to clear out the timber claim. He did, indeed, saw off a few dead limbs, and cut down a tree the lightning had blasted. Further than that, he wouldn't have let anybody clear the timber lot. He would have died defending it. The timber claim was his refuge. In the open, grassy spots, shut in by the bushy walls of yellowing ash trees, he felt unmarried and free. Free to smoke as much as he liked, and to read and dream. Some of his dreams would have frozen his young wife's blood with horror, and some would have melted his mother's heart with pity. To lie in the hot sun and look up at the stainless blue of the autumn skies, to hear the dry rustle of the leaves as they fell, and the sound of the bold squirrels leaping from branch to branch. To lie thus and let his imagination play with life, that was the best he could do. His thoughts, he told himself, were his own. He was no longer a boy. He went off into the timber claim to meet a young man more experienced and interesting than himself, who had not tied himself up with compromises. End of Book 3, Chapter 3. Recording by Tom Weiss.